most people start with Presbyterians with the Reformation, but I'm going to start a lot earlier than that and see where we have our Scottish roots, and that's really where we begin. And so I'm going to go and, well, let's see. Now, how come I can't? Wait. Okay, here we are. Here we are. Presbyterians actually begin with St. Columba back in Scotland, and it goes back to the Isle of Iona. And I'm going to go back that far because everything I've read about Presbyterians and know throughout my entire life is that Presbyterians have a Scottish background. But it didn't just start in Scotland back in the Reformation. It started with the Church of Scotland. It began earlier than that. Where did the church come from in Scotland? A lot of it came from, well, from the Celtic tradition. And that's really one of the main streams that lead to our Presbyterian denomination and theology today. It's not the only one, but it certainly is a major one that often we have neglected, and we are finding out more and more about our Celtic heritage from Ireland and Scotland. As you may know, we're doing more with Celtic spirituality with our Celtic Evensong service on Wednesdays, and we have different Celtic prayers and different Iona music, and we'll talk a little bit more about that through some of the slides coming up. But it starts with St. Columba. You'll see here in the 6th century, St. Columba, Irish abbot and missionary evangelist. He founded the abbey on Iona around 563 AD. I encourage you, if you ever have any vacation plans, and if indeed we can take vacations again, to go to Iona. We've taken 2 groups from our church to Iona in 2016 and 2019. We can do that again. It's one of my favorite, and Jenny's and my favorite places. And it's an isle about a mile and a half by 3 miles wide and long. And it is one of those thin places, as the Celts say, between heaven and earth. There's hardly anything that separates heaven from earth. And so there's Iona and there's Columba. I think that is a picture, a stained glass window of him that may show up. I think it's in the St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. Okay, so here's a picture of the Abbey on Iona. You see it's a stock photo, but that's okay. There's a lot of photos of it, but that's the one I found. And here's some of the main parts of Celtic Christianity, which is a stream that comes into our present day Presbyterianism. Creation care, big creation care. In fact, the Celts did not have this big abbey. It was plopped down right where you see it, right where the Celts used to worship under the stars, under the sky. And the Benedictines came in and they thought that wasn't right and correct. And so they plopped this big building down in the 12th century. And so they kind of took care of that whole idea of the Celts. They were trying to obliterate it. And so another part is no hierarchy. In fact, that's a precursor to the Presbyterians who do things by committee. We don't have bishops and a pope and so forth. And we know all those kind of stories, and we'll find out more as we go through these weeks. Inclusion, always been inclusion in the Celtic tradition. In fact, a lot of the leaders of the Celtic communities were women, and that was so unusual back in those days. And so very proud of that fact that we're part of that heritage. And then the justice and peace part of the Celtic tradition. So, so there's the picture. There's some of the basic forms of Celtic Christianity that come down to us today. And then I'm just going to move forward and see. And then I saw something about from Richard Rohr, and it may be wise just to read something from a Franciscan about the Celts. I'll just read this if you can't read it on your own screen. On the margins of the Roman Empire, Ireland and Scotland helped hand down the Christian contemplative lineage. The Romans had conquered much of Europe by the time of Jesus' birth. Though they ruled Britain, the Romans never occupied Ireland or parts of Scotland. This allowed the Celtic culture and Christian monks the freedom to thrive independently. They weren't controlled by Roman practicality or Greek thinking. When Christian missionaries arrived by the 3rd century, the Celts blended their pagan or creation-based spirituality with Christian liturgy, practice, and structure. As a result, Celtic Christianity was still grounded in the natural world, and they had much easier access to a cosmic notion of the Christ.
No.
So any thoughts about any of those things I've said so far? I mean, we are starting back a lot earlier than we might have thought, but I thought it was really important to get the Celts in there. So you know the connection, that we're not just doing something way off base, being Presbyterians and having Celtic prayers and so forth in our worship. It's part of our heritage. Okay. And then Richard Rohr goes on to say, perhaps we can think of Celtic Christians as an alternative community on the edge of the inside of organized Christianity. Lacking the structure and support of the organized church, radical forms of Christianity never thrive for very long. Without the Irish monks, much of Celtic practice and thought would not have passed on to us all at all, onto us at all. And so that's really true. In fact, through the years, the Empire Church, the Church of Rome, tried to get rid of Celtic Christians. And we'll see what happened there. In fact, there were laws, I think, in Scotland back in the 1800s. The other Christians that weren't Celtic thought that the Celts were a little too frivolous. They were having too much fun. And so they didn't like that. And so here we go. What happens here is the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD. Now there's a photograph of the church there in Whitby. And the history of this is that you see Rome was sacked in 410, and for 200 years, there was this breathing space, a separation between the Celts and the Roman church. So 2 centuries, a golden age of Celtic mission. And then the imperial mission arrives in 597 and started to have a lot of conflicts with the way the Celts were leading their own Christian communities. And so they finally met at this in Whitby, England, in 664 AD. There was a King Oswy, who was a Celt by heritage. He was brought up in a Celtic household. He married the queen, who was from the Roman church. And so there's a conflict inside their household. And it showed up in the Synod of Whitby. They tried to iron out the differences. The whole delegation came from Rome to talk it all over. And guess who won? Yeah, the Empire Church won. And the Celts were scattered to the far reaches of the empire, which brought them back into the far edges of Britain, beyond the reach, really, of the Roman church. It was just too far away. And so they didn't have a whole lot of control over the Celts if they were that far away. And there you go with Ireland, Scotland and Ireland, and the Iona community was beyond the reach of Rome. And so they could then still continue what they were doing for at least a while. Let me just go on here. Are we good with the Celts? We're going to move up a lot of years now, but that's our heritage. There's a lot of stories about Celtic Christianity and how a lot of the monks were killed in the northern part of Iona by the Vikings. Benedictines take over, and they aren't good to them either. There's a whole long history, but let's put that aside, knowing that's our background, and get to somebody we think is really the main man of Presbyterianism. I hope you have all heard of John Calvin. I hope that's the case, and I hope you see that he looks like a nice guy. That's one of the few pictures we have of him, lithographs or drawings or whatever that would be, a long beard. Sometimes I've seen him with a pointy hat, but here he is, French theologian, pastor, reformer, and a key figure in the Protestant Reformation. He was a lawyer and then changed over and became part of the one of the main figures in the reformation of the church during the 1600s. He was a principal figure in Calvinism, but Calvinism doesn't equal John Calvin. It was another, other influences came in, but he had his name attached to it. But we have predestination, sovereignty of God, salvation of the human soul from death and eternal damnation. So there's a lot of things caught up in that. That's our heritage as well with John Calvin. I don't know. Anyone have any thoughts about John Calvin? I don't want to go too quickly here about, every story. I was down at a Methodist clergy retreat from Wednesday to Friday, south of Cloudcroft, central New Mexico. I was invited by one of my Methodist friends, and I was one of, I think, 11 or 12 of us. I was the only Presbyterian there, and they were delighted to have a Presbyterian. And they kept saying, oh, so predestination, oh, John Calvin, you're a Calvinist, and all blah, blah, blah. So I didn't know really what to say. They were all talking John Wesley stuff. And we're known as being Calvinists. We're known as being attached to predestination, but not many people know a lot more about us. So it's kind of interesting that that's what they came up with as Methodists. So John Calvin, he spent a lot of his time in Geneva and really formed that city into kind of a city on the hill, a city of God. And there are some really good stories about what Geneva did. There was a plague going on, and there's a lot of movement across Europe at that time, as there always seemed to be, immigrants everywhere. Geneva, under Calvin's guidance, became really that welcoming, hospitable city to those who were in great need. And they put structures into place so that the stranger was welcomed and cared for. There were hospitals that sprung up to help those who were dealing with the plague, and John Calvin was part of all of that, a leader in that. So Geneva was quite a city back then under Calvin. There's a lot of good things that people don't know about Calvin. We look at him as a stern leader of the Reformation, but he also had that side of him that was welcoming and tried to meet the needs of the poor and the immigrants and the refugees. So a little word or so about Calvin. Any questions or thoughts about Calvin? Well, then let's move on. So Calvinism can be misleading because the religious tradition which it denotes has always been diverse, with a wide range of influences rather than a single founder. However, almost all of them drew heavily from the writings of Augustine of Hippo, a millennium prior. So anyway, just to give you a little sense of Calvinism versus just John Calvin. Okay, now here we go. I couldn't do John Calvin without John Knox. I don't know if you know much about John Knox. Jenny and I have watched the movies, just about those days in Scotland and some of the history there, and they're exciting and so forth. And John Knox does not come across very well at all. It says here, he was a minister of the Christian gospel who advocated violent revolution. And so he was considered one of the most powerful preachers of his day, but only 2 of the hundreds of sermons he preached were ever published. He is a key figure in the formation of modern Scotland, yet there is only one monument erected to him in Scotland, and his grave lies beneath a parking lot. So just want to let you know, I don't know who made that decision to have a parking lot put over his grave, but it must have come with a lot of discussion. But also, does it indicate anything about how people thought about him? I don't know. But here's the picture of the parking lot. It's right outside of St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. the mother church of Presbyterianism. And so it is so amazing. It's lot 23, it looks like. And there you see in the bottom there, you see the little plaque that talks about John Calvin in that 23rd parking space. Anyway, it's kind of interesting. And there's St. Giles right there beyond, as you see. And this may be a reason why. This is one photograph that has people kind of, he's kind of overbearing. And so maybe maybe there was a reason why his grave is in a parking lot. Who knows? But he was quite a figure and quite a menacing figure and had a lot to say. But let's move on from John Knox, if we could. Okay, here we go. Presbyterians at Jamestown, 1607. Some of these next slides I've gotten from the Historical Society of the Presbyterian Church. And so these come from there, and some of the photographs you'll see come from them as well. Presbyterians were there in Jamestown in 1607. We were there in the very beginning, even from England, it says here. And then 1620 to 1640, the Puritans came to America with the Mayflower in 1620, and many are Presbyterians. And so we are part of the group that was here in the very beginning, those first migrations here. And the first congregation was organized in 1640 in Southampton, Long Island, and thought to be the oldest Presbyterian church in America. Southampton, Long Island. Keep going here. And then here's a big one. Westminster Confession, published in 1648. And it says here, the humble advice of the Assembly of Divines at Westminster, now known as the Westminster Confession of Faith, intended as a consensus confession for all of the United Kingdom. The Confessions with its catechisms becomes the confessional standard for Presbyterian churches in England and Scotland. There's a whole history going on in England around this time, when it was no longer, with the king, there was Cromwell going on, taking over for a while in the 1640s. The Westminster Confession, written there at Westminster Abbey, and so forth. And so there's a whole history that we get into on our fourth Sunday as we look at the confessions. But just so you know, Presbyterians until 1967, they had the Westminster Confession of Faith, the larger and shorter catechisms, as the confession, the entire Presbyterian faith and denomination and theology. So we became multi-confessional in 1967, and we'll talk more about that in the fourth week of this class. But here we go, 1648, another big date for the Presbyterians. And then anyway, Francis McKemie arrives in the country in 1683, and he earns the title of the father of American Presbyterianism. He founded many Presbyterian churches. So it started, 1640 was the first congregation in Southampton. 1683, Francis McKemie is really starting more and more Presbyterian churches, and we continue to grow that way. Going through some of the main things that have happened in our history now. This is a little on your left-hand side. You'll see, some writings that started the first presbytery in Philadelphia in 1706. They still have a document there that talks about that. 1706 in Philadelphia. Philadelphia being, one of the main places of being of Presbyterianism. We continue. The Log College. Did you ever have any idea that Princeton started as the Log College back in 1718? William Tennant, minister and educator, arrives in Philadelphia. His Cabin Academy, dubbed the Log College, 1746, evolves over several decades into the College of New Jersey and now Princeton University. I believe, if I counted up right, at one point there were, I think, about 66 institutions of higher learning that began by the Presbyterians. That were started by the Presbyterians, Princeton being one of them. They're all across the country, part of our heritage. And then, here it is, Westminster Confession adopted in 1729 as the official, confession of the whole church. And that's where we've always been known as, being part of the Westminster Confession of Faith. I remember when I was in college of Worcester in Ohio, I think it was my senior year, there was a scholarship fund that if you could memorize the Shorter Catechism and answer all the questions there, you would get $500. And so I remember on my bunk bed with a few of my friends, they were testing me on this. I was so looking forward to getting $500, but I never got to the test. It was just too long. I can only remember, what's the chief end of man? The chief end of man is to enjoy God. What is it? And enjoy him forever. Okay, well, see, I wasn't good at that, and so I'm $500 less wealthy. Yes,
Dick Rowe, I have that $500. I learned the whole thing, all of those questions and answers.
Oh, you're a better man than me, Dick. That's wonderful. That is great. Good for you.
At seminary.
Yeah.
In seminary, okay. Do you still have it? Did you keep the $500 in a separate fund just to look at, or you used it? Okay.
Oh, it's kind of
It went to you.
Well, that's great, Dick. Thank you for letting me know that somebody actually did it. Good. All right. And then we move on to John Witherspoon. You probably heard of him. John Witherspoon, Declaration of Independence. He was the only active minister to sign it back in 1776. And he became the president of the College of New Jersey earlier than that. John Witherspoon, a big name in Presbyterian heritage. Is it not the name of our denominational headquarters in Louisville, the Witherspoon Center? Am I correct on that? So anyway, we have that heritage with Princeton still, from those early days with John Witherspoon. There's a Witherspoon Society as well, and that's more on the progressive side of the church. And so we hear that. Now, the first General Assembly in 1789, again in Philadelphia, a center of the early Presbyterians, May 21st, 1789. That was from a play, apparently. It's a photograph of a play. You'll see there, they're reenacting it. The first General Assembly, okay. And then the Protestant Revival of 1801. A lot of things happened in 1801. There was an agreement, a plan of union, to plant churches on the frontier. 1801, the Presbyterians and Congregationalists always got along pretty well together. They thought in many similar ways, but they had a different form of government, as we know, and it still comes down to us today. But I went to Yale Divinity School, and there weren't many Presbyterians in Connecticut or anywhere in New England. There were some churches, but they're mostly congregational. But south of a particular line, where New Jersey would be, there's all the Presbyterians down there. They made an agreement in 1801 that the Congregationalists would take the north, and north of that line, the Presbyterians go south. So they wouldn't be competing against each other. And then that led to more planting churches on the frontier as well. That happened in a lot of places later on. I think about New Mexico, and I won't get into the history of New Mexico, but there's a lot of Presbyterians in the north, but there's other denominations more towards the south. than Presbyterians are. Cuba was split up between Presbyterians and Methodists down in Cuba. We have the western side, and Methodists have the eastern side of Cuba. Things like that. So this was not the only time it happened, but it certainly is noticeable when you go to New England that there's very few Presbyterian churches up there. And I always thought it'd be fun to have a nice meeting in the woods like this, and everyone looks so tame and listening to the preacher. I just thought it'd be nice, for a communion service out in the woods. So just keep an eye on that picture. Maybe one day we'll do that. These old photographs. Look at that. Let's move on and see what's next. Okay, I just put this in here because it's interesting to note that early on, 1807 was the first African and Presbyterian church. Once again in Philadelphia. This is not the founding pastor, but another pastor, John Gloucester, the first, one of the first pastors of that African Presbyterian church. And then 1818, the General Assembly, that's GA, General Assembly, was against slavery. And that's pretty early on. They made a stand. And so I'm always proud to know that the Presbyterians had that in their background, that they were against slavery. And there's a photograph of inside of a book cover of a book. So we started those stances early in our history. 1833, a first foreign missionary. John Finney, first foreign missionary, sails for Liberia in Africa. And then in 1833, November that year, Matthew and Harriet Laird sailed for Africa. But then they both contract African fever, could be yellow fever, malaria, and die in 1834. And you see Harriet Laird to the left. So I can't even imagine what it's like to be a missionary back in those days, trying to get to the far off places, and how dangerous that was. But it started in 1833 and it went down. I'm looking at the rows again. They're products of this history, all the places you were. And so thankful for what you've done to continue that long line of missionaries and the work there in different countries. So thank you, Dick and Ann. So, and then interesting, I put this one in, the ordination of Henry Highland Garnett, a freed slave ordained by the Troy, New York Presbytery. Editor, preacher, and abolitionist, Garnett goes on to preach before Congress and becomes the U.S. ambassador to Liberia. So there's that connection to Liberia, still with the missionary work done there. But we had African Americans early on in our tradition, at least in the 1800s. So glad for that as well. Here's something that goes on here. The old school, new school schism in 1837. Old school and new school. I won't go into all of it. It's a little complicated, but old school led by Princeton's Charles Hodge. In fact, I even at Yale in my seminary days, even had something written by him that we still used. In fact, it may have been some Greek translation of something, but his name was still around. But theologically conservative was the old school, and new school led by Jonathan Edwards, and that whole second awakening that happened in the mid-19th century, led by Jonathan Edwards and others, all about that whole revival, being caught by the Spirit again, and God's Spirit is blowing again in the world, and a lot of new things began to happen. But there was that old school, that's right, we all want those revivals, and the new school said, sure, of course, that's part of who we are. The new school actually became part of what Yale Divinity School was all about, as well. But as you might imagine, there's a split over slavery. And so again, slavery begins to be a big part of our history here. This schism, it goes on for up to 30 years, old school, new school. Don't think that the 20th century or 21st century has any claim on schisms and people leaving churches and churches leaving denominations and people being mad at each other and so forth. It started from the very beginning. And so then First Chinese Presbyterian Church, 1853. I thought it was just interesting to know that that started way back when. And so we're branching out, not only African churches, but a Chinese Presbyterian church as well in California. And let's see, okay. Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America, 1861. I'll just read this just to get it into our minds. In the midst of the secession crisis, the General Assembly, the old school, pledges loyalty to the federal government. Southern commissioners protest and withdraw. And the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America organizes that winter. Thus begins the split that in all its manifestations went, we get to a few more slides about that, but it started here over slavery. We split into 1983. We had a Southern church and a Northern church. And it started here in 1861 with the beginning of the Civil War. And let me just get to this. And then Presbyterian Church in the U.S. officially organizes in 1865. The PCUS, composed largely of members of the former Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America, convenes its first General Assembly in Macon, Georgia, December 1865. And PCUS lasted until 1983. And that's when it merged in with the United Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, which is the Northern Church, as it was always seemed to be called, North and South. But here we are, the Civil War and slavery began that split. And in 1869, the reunion of the old and new school General Assemblies in Pittsburgh, ending the Presbyterian 30 Years' War. And so there it is. Imagine that. And I'm going to have one more slide, and we have a little time for any thoughts or reflections or questions about anything that you might have. But I have one more slide, and here we are. The Presbyterian Family Connections. I know it's kind of small to read, and I know we lose things on the left and the right, but it gives you a sense of all the different ways we've split off, we've done different things, we've merged, we have different ideas, we have different theologies, we have old and new, we're upset with each other, we leave, we come, here it is, everybody. I think it's a little too much to memorize, but it is good to note that there are a number of other Presbyterian denominations that even come down to us today. One of the right smack dab in the middle is the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. Anyone hear of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church or have that in your heritage? Well, that's from the South. It's often, I think, headquarters maybe in Memphis. It started around, I'm trying to see, it started way back in 1816 in my notes. In 1906, I think there's some kind of hope to merge. 1810 maybe 1810, and there's still a few notable Cumberland Presbyterians. William Jennings Bryan was a Cumberland Presbyterian. It has its Southern roots. It was one of the first to ordain women, and to have Africans as part of their church. It had a real liberal streak to it. In recent years, it's become more conservative. Some of the liberal pastors have left the denomination to come to PCUSA. And so it's gone that direction. There's about 70,000 Cumberland Presbyterians right now in over 70 congregations. But that's just another strand. And I had a Cumberland Presbyterian classmate at Yale and had no clue, never heard of them before. And so it's just another branch of being Presbyterian. So we have a few minutes left. Just any comments, this brief run through the history of Presbyterians from way back when to the Celts, all the way to 1869. Next Sunday, Christine Vogel will take it from here and lead us from 1869 all the way to this present moment next Sunday morning. But right now, any thoughts about where we've been and who we are with our heritage?
Harry, it's Judy. I've got a question.
Yeah.
And I sent it on chat, but I don't know whether you guys were looking at chat or not. What is our, and this realizing that I'm a relatively new Presbyterian, what is our current belief or thinking on predestination? Is that a whole
No,
lot?
I don't know if we've heard anything from anyone about predestination in a long time. Let me just give you a little quick background on that because we never got to it last week in our class. That was one of the big issues I was going to bring up, but we were too busy with other things, with some of these hard questions. Predestination often is connected to being Presbyterian. And my understanding and my learning of this and training of this is that back in the day, back in the 1500s, 1600s, everyone was so worried about sin. They were so worried, are they going to go to heaven? Are they doing enough? Did they do things bad? Who's going to be saved? Who's not? Blah, 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 blah. And John Calvin said, you know what? We can't know. And so don't worry about it. Act as if you are saved, you are loved by God, and know that and live your life accordingly. And go and look at everyone else as if they are saved as well, and treat each other well that way. Don't wring your hands every moment as if, am I going to heaven or not? Am I doing enough? And that's just tying people up in knots. And so that was the idea. You're predestined for salvation, for life beyond this one. Only God knows. And if only God knows, we don't know. But let's just imagine that, yes, we are going to heaven. Now, there's double predestination, that some have been elected before time to go to heaven, and some elected before time to go to hell. Oh my goodness, what in the world would that be all about? And so that's a double predestination, up or down. And so, in one way, it just takes away the anguish over whether we're doing enough to earn our way into heaven, or we're just so upset over the idea that maybe we aren't. John Calvin says, come on, people, imagine God as loving God who you are already accepted into this life of the ages, life eternal. That's my training, that's my memory, that's my understanding, but I don't think I've ever preached on it. So I don't know, does that help at all? It's not predetermination, that's a whole different thing. Predetermination is that everything you do has been predetermined before time. That means that I was predetermined to teach this class before time ever began. So that right now on October 11th, here I am. Thank goodness I'm doing what I was supposed to do. But that's predetermined. Predestination is a wider view that we are indeed loved by a loving God who, let's just believe that God has us in God's hands from this time on eternal.
Rick, can I just comment on your chart that's up there right now?
Yeah.
Because my family was involved in it, I guess, from the very beginning when they came to America in the late 1600s, early 1700s from Scotland.
Wow.
So they were there from the left side of your church, of that chart,
Yeah.
all the way across. And if you go to and in the middle there, my dad as an elder was involved in some of the breakup and reunions of some of this stuff. But if you go all the way to the right, still 7 Presbyterian denominations. And even though my family started almost 300 years ago back there, now they're split up again amongst the 7 that currently exist. So it reminds me of the politics that's going on right now.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, interesting, isn't it? You know, I look at that chart and I'm just so amazed that we actually came out as well as we did. You know, that we're still, you know, can get along with each other. Hopefully, there's been so many splits, but then that we have PCOSA is the largest of all of these denominations that you see in front of you there. But a nice story, David. I didn't know you went back to the 1700s.
The skeleton in our closet is when I got married and I found out that my wife's great uncle was a brigadier general in the Confederate Army and actually got wounded in Gettysburg. I thought, aha, we have a skeleton in our closet. Well, sadly, when the Masons settled in and you went over to Kentucky, they were slaveholders.
Oh, geez. Okay. Any other questions? Thank you for that one too, David. And Judy, did I answer that well enough that we can talk more about predestination at some point?
Yes, I mean it's just, you know, something that, again, I came out of the Southern Baptist tradition, and that was something that, you know, I remember hearing at different services and stuff like that, not necessarily out of my daddy's mouth, but you know, that the definition of what's been used against the Presbyterian Church as being aligned with predestination is that it was exclusionary. That if you're exactly like us, you know, then you're not going to be saved.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that may be a way you could construe that, but I don't think that, from what I know, is what John Calvin had in mind.
But he was talking to the Christian church.
Oh yeah. Okay, I see what you mean. Okay, not
So,
just Presbyterians versus Baptists. It's
Yep.
a larger thing. You know, he probably was, and I think that's maybe one reason why we don't talk about it too much anymore, because we've been so connected to predestination. And it's so funny, that word keeps hounding us as Presbyterian. Maybe it's because they both start with the letter P, you know, and it's just easy to think about it. But I think right now, I don't think any Presbyterian, at least in my strain of the Presbyterian, or stream of the Presbyterian Church, would ever say it's only for Christians, you know, that there's salvation. I don't think that's where we are at all, at least in my.
I didn't think so either, but I just, you know, it just is one of those kind of things that are hanging out there that we don't really know. So yeah, it's
right.
It's free of. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up. I think we evolved through the years, have a wider, broader understanding of who God is and who we are, to include the world now and not just our own tribe. So we may have one. I have 9:49 now. We're going to try to end at 9:50, but I can entertain one more question if it's good and easy to answer.
Harry, I was. You said that the new school, the old school, split on slavery, but you didn't say which school went with which side.
Oh, okay. The old school, new school stuff. I'm fairly certain that the old school was still more of the slavery thing, and the new school was the abolitionist side. Yeah. So thanks for clearing that up. You know, there's so many nuances that old school, new school split. You know, it started over the revivalism of Jonathan Edwards and the Second Awakening. But of course, when you get to schools or groups of people, they always seem to find more reasons to not like it. And so, but slavery certainly got into the conversation there. And so it took a long time to figure that one out. Yeah. Well, I am so glad that you stayed throughout all of this history with me today. We covered a lot of years. I hope that helped a little bit to fill in some gaps with your own understanding of the Presbyterian heritage that we all share. We hopefully, maybe we don't, who's on this, but most of us do. And I look forward to continuing the history to the present day from this point forward, 1869 to our present day. There's a lot of amazing things that have happened with Presbyterians in those years. So join us next week at 9 o'clock to 9:50 with Christine Vogel. And I really appreciate you all being here.